He raises Lazarus from the dead. And the result of that is the Sanhedrin is the more angry, and they are determined to kill him. But the whole city is abuzz with the question, is he going to come? And then Jesus makes his way to Ephraim. And knowing well the habits of the Galilean Jews, Luke 17, when Passover nears, he goes up and joins one of those Passover, those bands, if you don't mind, of Passover pilgrims. And he makes his way for 4 or 5 days, all the way teaching, doing miracles, and so on, comes to Bethany, just outside the Sabbath zone, and stops, and all those people go into the city. And I never said this to you, that they are, as they go in, they are bearing a twofold message. I have in your sheet, but number one, he is coming. That's what everybody's. I always like to say that all those several hundred people who are with Jesus get their Warholian 15 minutes, if you know what I'm saying. You remember that? But so they get their 15 minutes of fame, and he is coming, but they have another message. And that is, he will be here Sunday morning. Why? Because he stopped in Bethany. It's outside the Sabbath zone. So he's not going to come till Sunday morning. And then you have the whole Friday and all of Saturday to that percolate through the city. And without any concert, any orchestration, but just one by one, this family, that neighborhood, this clan who've come up and so on, they say, let's just go out and see. So early in the morning, they make their way out. And they're lining and the whole hillside, I think, of the Mount of Olives. And now as Jesus rides over that hill and along the one road that comes from Bethany to Jerusalem, here are probably hundreds of thousands of people welcoming him and thus tying the hands of his enemies. And Jesus does, in fact, go up to the temple and then go back. But we left you with this question given Sunday, why Friday? And I said the answer is Monday and Tuesday, days of Messianic proclamation. Now, I am going to work through this very, one might say, criminally quickly, okay? But Monday and Tuesday, and I'll tell you something. These are days really, they're so exciting. I think if you came to me with one free ride on your newly invented time machine, I think I'd dial up Monday and Tuesday. I'm telling you, this is some of the most, but I've got to go quickly. But so very quickly, Monday and Tuesday, days of Messianic proclamation. And listen, this is on your sheet, but I'm going to go. So on the way into Jerusalem, he curses the fig tree. I'd love to talk to you about this, but suffice it to say that, as I said to you before, Jews don't begin the day with food, and so they snack along the way. And here's the fig tree, and it's perfectly legitimate. It's not the season of harvestable figs, is the point. I think it's Matthew who says it was not the season of figs, but what it means is the figs you would harvest. And so at any rate, there are no figs, and so he curses the tree. And because he sees in it, look, I think it's Jesus' heart is heavy. You got to understand that. All of this excitement yesterday, he knows how absolutely shallow and self-serving it is. And he knows that this city is going to turn on him. He knows it from the scriptures. And so this tree becomes emblematic of that generation of Jews, because all this, the leaves, but no real fruit. And so Sunday was the leaves, and Friday is going to be the no fruit. But then he goes on and he cleanses the temple for the first time. What am I doing here? I'd love to talk about this, but let me just say that early on in his ministry, in John chapter 2, Jesus had cleansed the temple. And this is, up to that point, the only other incident in the record is that he had changed the water to wine. And just a few days later, says, he went and cleansed the temple at Passover. Now, 2 points to be made. Number one, this is a depiction of Herod's rebuilt temple. And understand that this area out here is called the Court of the Gentiles. It's a huge court. Like I say, it's about 36 acres. The Temple Mount is, and about 10 and a half football fields you could put there. Josephus says that there were times when they'd have 210,000 people in the temple. And I wondered about that, but that same temple, the temple itself was destroyed, but the temple courts are still there today. In order to build it, Herod had to build this huge retaining wall system, because the temple is built on a threshing floor, and you can't be building a temple on a little mountaintop. And so they had to build a system of supporting walls to build it on, and that's where you have that 400-ton ashlar that's part of that. So even and the Romans came, they tried to destroy everything, and they hacked away at those retaining walls for several months, and finally they went home. And so, frankly, the Muslims come in the 600 and rebuild it, and so the Temple Mount, as it's called, is exactly the square. It's exactly as it was in Jesus' day, as to its shape and so on. And so I'm saying that it staggered me when I read 210,000 people. But in point of fact, did you read in Ramadan just a couple days ago they had 500,000 up there all at once? And so it's a huge area. Well, what had happened is this, very, very quickly, and this applies to both the first cleansing in John 2 and then the latter cleansing in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, on Monday of the Passion Week. But as I say, Passover was the only one of the three pilgrimage feasts, Passover in the spring and Pentecost in the summer and then Tabernacles in the fall. Only one of those demands a personal sacrifice, a family sacrifice, and that's Passover. And you had to bring a lamb for your family. And that lamb had to be slain in the temple. And so, again, there are various estimates, but as high as 200,000 lambs that were slain in Jesus' day. And so, well, what's really germane to what we need to know now is this, that the lamb had to be slain. And before, you had to have the lamb inspected by the 10th of Nisan. So by 4 days before, the lamb, you had to go to the priest and he would inspect it. Then the lamb had to be with you. You had to treat it more like a pet than an animal for 4 days. And then on the 14th of Nisan, which is a month in the spring, you would take the lamb and it would be sacrificed in the temple. Now, normally the sacrifices took place in the inner court where the actual temple building was. But on the other hand, the rabbis, because they had so many lambs to sacrifice at this season, they declared that the court of the Gentiles, that big area on the outside, would be as the court of Israel, where they're normally done. And so what they would do is they would have long lines, kind of spokes, because there were only certain, am I making any sense? You have, this is a good place to see it. Can you see this? This is the temple itself and the court of Israel, but this is the court, and there were a number of gates that would give you entrance from the court of Israel, court of the Gentiles, into the court of the women of the court of Israel. And so the priests would make long lines, and they would go out all throughout the court of Gentiles, and there would be these apparatus set up, and you'd bring the lamb, you'd lay your hands on the lamb, you rest your weight with one very carefully, with a carefully honed knife, and generally you'd bring a dagger. There was a family dagger, and it was a silver. That's probably the two swords. Remember, Peter and John were sent to prepare, and they had probably brought their daggers. Remember, in the upper room, they say, well, we got two swords here. But at any rate, the point is that you would hand that dagger to the priest, and then he would very deftly slice the throat, and the lamb would collapse. But within less than a minute, they would haul him up by the back feet, drain the blood, skin, flay him, butcher him, give you the pieces you need for the Passover, and you'd be on your way, just one after. And the lines were this: when the lamb was slain, his blood had to be dashed against the altar, way there in the court of Israel. So those priests would hand over hand those censers with blood all the way in, and then they would, after they dash it, they'd take it over and wash it off in the laver, and then they go back out. So it was just it was Henry Ford, eat your heart out, assembly lines. What's going on here? And they were very good at it, and so they could slay thousands and thousands of lamb as they had to, because what the Bible says explicitly is the lamb had to be slain between the evenings. Now, most translations would put at twilight or at dusk, but that's not very good. In Jewish life, because just of the dynamics of the weather and so on, the sun is very hot, but in the middle of the afternoon, as the hot air begins to ascend, you get the displacement breezes off the Mediterranean. They're delicious. That's the first evening, middle of the afternoon. Then you've got till the sun disappears beyond the horizon. That's a second. So you got about 3.5, 4 hours to do all the slaying. This is serious stuff. And so, but the point is that you have to bring a lamb, and you can bring it from home if you wish, but most didn't. They would buy a lamb, and then that lamb would be taken to the priest, and the Sadducees, who were the priests, who were horribly crooked. Let me point something out to you here. This right here. I'm just going to put it all up there. Do I give you that in the notes? I don't remember. Well, at any rate, this is a good thing to. Here's. All right. I'm talking about the abuses in the temple that angered people. But to appreciate it, I want to go back and say, here's everything you need to know about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And by the way, the scribes are a subset of the Pharisees, all right? Pharisees is just a fraternity of people who do nothing. They don't work, they don't have jobs. They do nothing but study and keep the law. The scribes are the ones who write it down. So scribes and Pharisees, one group. Sadducees, and it means, I won't get into the name, but the Sadducees are the high priests in the Bible. They are the priests who run the temple, and they're entirely in bed with Rome. And their counterparts are the Herodians you run into just a couple of times. But suffice to say, here's everything you need to know about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, there's a lot more you should know, but you're not getting started if you don't need that, if you don't know this. That makes sense to you? The Pharisees run the synagogue. Now, how much do we have to back up here? The synagogue is not a church, it's not a temple, it is a gathering place. And it developed during the intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew, and everywhere the Jews went. Matter of fact, they're under obligation. If you've got 10 adult men who on Sabbath can walk to a central spot, so you got 10 families that live, and they can find a spot where they can, all 10 of them, without breaking the Sabbath day law, the Sabbath day journey, you got to have a synagogue. And so synagogues are everywhere. But the Pharisees run the synagogue, because you can't have a synagogue without a copy of the Torah. And you can't go down to wherever, Barnes and Noble. You got to find somebody who will copy you out. And those are the scribes. So the scribes copy the scriptures. They're entirely of the Pharisaic mentality. And the Pharisees, are the rabbi, the Pharisees, they run the synagogue. The Pharisees are revered. I say they are revered by the people. Because number one, they have, and this is so important, they insisted their gospel was a gospel of pure works. And what they taught was that God, and they went on and on. I mean, you have in the Talmudic literature, God is so gracious. God, we have a gracious God. What do I mean by that? He is so gracious, he gave us the law. And all we have to do is keep the law, and we can be sure of the kingdom. The kingdom, you talk about going to heaven, really it'd be better if we learned to talk about, that's a good thing. It beats all the alternatives, I'll tell you that. But that's a stopping place, okay? We're headed for that kingdom, right? But the point is that if you're going to get into the kingdom, according to the Pharisees, you had to keep the law. And the more fastidiously you do it, and not only the Mosaic law, but all of our laws that we built, they call them fence laws. We have all of these man-made laws, we call them fence laws, and we're building a fence around the Mosaic law. So lest you be careless about this, the Bible says don't work on the Sabbath. It's not very specific about it. Probably a good thing not to pick up sticks, if you know what I'm saying. But the fact is that it doesn't spell it out. Well, the rabbis did. And as I understand it to this day, I've never seen this happen, but I've read about it, that in an Orthodox practicing Jewish home, there's a drawer with a bunch of just black little cloths, and on Friday afternoon, the children go and they put one of those cloths over every mirror in the house, because if they don't, maybe on Shabbat, one of the women will go by and she'll notice a gray hair, forget that it's Shabbat, and pluck it, and that would be reaping. So if you really are loyal to the law, you cover your mirrors. And I could go on. You couldn't drag you could carry like a chair across the dirt floor, but you couldn't drag it. You'd leave a furrow. That'd be plowing, and I mean, there's no end to it. Well, the point is that the Pharisees taught that the way to get into the kingdom was to keep the law, and not only the Mosaic law, but these fence laws. And we do nothing but that's what the Pharisees are. They didn't do anything but keep the law, Mosaic law, but more specifically the fence laws, and they were always inventing new ones, because if you could find one spot where you were doing something the next guy wasn't, you're even more righteous than he. But here's the important thing. The common man was convinced. Number one, there was sort of an intrinsic respect for those, because they keep the law so carefully. That's all they do. But number two, they were also taught that although I can't, I got to go to the fields every day. I don't have time to keep the law, nothing. But if I support the rabbi, if I encourage him and if I give alms to him and so on, because it doesn't work. If I do all of that, then I can get in to the kingdom on his coattails. Now factor that in, because Jesus is going to confront those Pharisees. And like I say, that's why the Pharisees were revered by the common man. They were also feared, because if you made them angry, they could put you aposynagoge. Remember John 9? He put them out of the synagogue. Don't you be getting tossed out of your local church. But I'm telling you, this is something of a different order, because you're probably going to have to move. You're not going to be, nobody's going to have anything to do with you. You're going to lose your job and so on. So it's a serious thing. The Pharisees had a heavy club they could beat you over the head with, and you just intrinsically regarded them because they're law keepers. Now, that's exactly what Jesus came to challenge. All right, that's the Pharisees. I'm going to come back to it in just a couple minutes. On the other hand, the Sadducees ran the temple. Now, whereas the Pharisees ran the synagogue kind of de facto, it's just the way it was. The Sadducees ran the temple. That was de jure. That was law. Rome had declared that. They had bribed Rome every year. They would bribe. They would establish a baseline. Okay, you give us control of the temple, and we'll produce this much money for Rome, and everything that's left over, we get. So not exactly a commendable situation. And what they had discovered, so I'm saying the Sadducees ran the temple, and the Sadducees were despised by the common man, and they returned the favor. They had no regard. They were wealthy. There was a special bridge that they had built so that they could walk from their neighborhood up on the Western Hill over to the temple without going through the common man and so on. So there was nothing but contempt and anger in both directions. Now, here's the point. When Jesus, I'm going back. So Jesus cleanses the temple, first of all, in John chapter 2. This is genius. And I don't think it's peak in either case. In other words, it's not P-I-Q-U-E, peak. It's not some momentary anger. It is a careful strategy. Because when Jesus cleanses the temple in John chapter 2, he immediately catapults himself into Jewish worldwide notoriety. This is Passover. I'm talking John 2, 3 years earlier, 4 years earlier, but this is Passover. And people have come, and you know what? They're getting on a bus and going home tomorrow, and they're not talking about anything else. And I like to say, if there was a woman that last month, and she was there and saw Jesus in John chapter 2 cleanse the temple, and last month she had sextuplets, this was more exciting, okay? There's nothing that could this Nazarene, we hate this, and this crazy Nazarene just grabs a cord, he starts to cut, and he drives them off there. That quickly, he would have been the folk hero of the masses. You couldn't buy a Jesus T-shirt, But my point is, he catapults himself into a notoriety and regard, and he angers. Look, all right, you know now, whose territory is he walking on when he cleanses the temple? The Sadducees hate the Pharisees. The Pharisees hate the Sadducees. How do you think the Pharisees felt about that? I'm sure this Jesus guy, he's okay. Look what he did. He got frustrated. Now, here's the interesting thing. There are 2 more Passovers where Jesus doesn't do anything about the temple, but for 3 years, he's going up and down the countryside, going from synagogue to synagogue. Now, whose territory is he on? See the point? And what happened is Jesus delighted the Pharisees and angered the Sadducees, and so he kind of protected them. Now, here's one other, I'm giving you a lot of background. It's going to become important this afternoon. But by reason of the fact that Jesus so immediately catapulted himself into Jewish worldwide fame, all right? And he was and then wherever he goes, he's doing miracles, he's healing people. So Jesus, I'll take the question we talked about this morning, if you remember, as to how did Jesus get away with the triumphal entry. You can put that same question over his whole ministry. How did he get away with it? And the answer is quite explicit, and that is, again and again, they wanted to take him, but they could not. Can you finish it? Because they feared the people. What did they fear? All right, wherever Rome had divided her entire empire up into all these governing regions, and over everyone there was an officer, and that officer had 2 responsibilities, and only 2 responsibilities, really. If he did these 2, he was safe and secure. If he didn't, he's gone. Number 1, What do you think? Collect the taxes, for heaven's sake. So I like to say that that's a long time ago, and it's a different culture, and it's hard for us to get in touch. But the fact is that the Roman government, the Roman Empire, had spent itself into abject poverty on the most self-serving, silly, short-sighted efforts, and so they were stone cold broke, and the only thing they could come up with was to tax their citizens more heavily. Now I know it's hard for us to appreciate. That was a long time ago, but that's exactly the situation. But and so number one, collect the taxes. Number two, keep the peace. Now that doesn't mean we talk about the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, but don't hear Irenicism and sweet. It's a heavy-handed, forced absence of violence. That's all the Pax Romana is. It's important, but Rome had this vast empire. She had this army stretched way beyond its limits, and Rome didn't want to have to come. If you're Pilate and you're in charge of Judea and Samaria, you keep a lid on things. And if in fact there's some sort of riot, and we don't have a huge force in Rome doesn't in Jerusalem, but they're going to have to go up to Damascus, or they're going to go down to Alexandria and bring forces. You're done. You're done. Heads are going to roll. Who started this? So Jesus' popularity throughout his ministry is what protected him from his enemies. First of all, the Jewish enemies, first of all, the Pharisees, first of all, the Sadducees, and now the Pharisees. But now, let's go back to the cleansing of them. Here's what I'm saying to you. In John chapter 2, listen, time out. I got no time for this, but let me just tell you. Today, because of the approach to the Gospels that I mentioned earlier, almost nobody in the academic world believes Jesus cleansed the temple twice. They say only did it once and somebody moved it for some theological reason. Oh, this makes me so upset. Because they believe that these are stories that are passed along and you can change things and so on. It's okay. No. It's absolutely true in all of its parts. John 2 is explicit. It happened early in his ministry. But what's so fascinating to me is that I think there is such strategy in this, because in John chapter 2, early in the first Passover, he cleanses the temple. He catapults himself into notoriety. He angers the Sadducees, delights the Pharisees. And now, for several years, he's been angering the Pharisees. You can watch it happen in the pages of the Gospels, that the Pharisees, he's out in their territory. They're everywhere. They're in every synagogue. And they're madder. And pretty soon, I mean, early on, they're trying to kill him, for heaven's sake. But I think the Sadducees, and here's a point I started to make, I never did. Because of Jesus' popularity, the Jewish leaders knew that they couldn't simply haul him off behind us. They couldn't do Stephen to him. They couldn't just haul him off somewhere and stone him, because there's going to be a riot and our heads are going to roll. And so what they have to do, this is so important, and it's so deliberate on Jesus' part. What they have to do in order to be rid of Jesus, they have to get the Romans to do that dirty work. And there's only one way to move the hand of the prefect Pilate, and that is through the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is 70 men, half of them, about half Pharisee and half Sadducee. So now Jesus angers the Sadducees, delights the Pharisees. Over months, he angers the Pharisees more and more, but the Sadducees, you don't hear anything about them until very, very late. But now, on Monday, he goes in and cleanses the temple a second time. Folks, he is signing his own death warrant. He knows it, because he's galvanizing the hatred of the Sadducees with the long simmering hatred of the Pharisees. And it's going to take him 5 days to get him on a cross. That makes sense to you? These cleansing of the temple are so big, so important. And I'm going to say again, I don't think some people will say, well, it says in Mark that on Sunday after and part of the triumphal entry, he went and looked around. Why didn't he cleanse the temple that night? I think that assumes the wrong thing. It assumes that it was some momentary anger. It wasn't. It was careful strategy, I believe. And so I'll leave it at that. He cleanses the temple, and I got to go way back, because I don't think I finished this thought, that the Sadducees, who ran the temple and made themselves bottomlessly wealthy by reason of the temple, and their big payday was Passover, and so the Sadducees, like I say, they're running the temple, but they had discovered something. Here's what I want to finish, and that is, you couldn't you had to bring a lamb, but it had to be inspected, and it had to be inspected by one of their priests. So they sort of set up that we wouldn't accept your lamb unless it was accepted by a priest who was giving us part of the. So there was a feed. What do I want to say? Uh, what is it? Yeah, it was crooked, but it was a. They were getting part of the action. The point is, and the Sadducees were, and in order to make that work, they had actually moved the business of selling the lambs. And the other thing is, when you came, you had to pay a temple tax, and it had to be in a certain, actually Tyrian from Phoenicia, but a certain currency. And many people brought a different currency, and the Sadducees volunteered that they would change, but at usurious rates. So now you're just innocently coming. You bought a lamb. You know your lamb is fine. You bring it to the priest. I'm sorry. What are you talking about? Well, there's no, I'm telling you, there's no pushback here. You can't. You just, and I picture him saying, I'm making this part up. There's a little booth over there, and I think the guy might take your lamb and trade because he's got lambs. You might notice a certain family resemblance, but that's not important. So, and so you go over, and I think we got a lot of First Samuel 2 going on here, because it may be a lamb which is deficient, but at any rate, deficient. No, not really a qualified lamb, but that's the one you have to bring because that's one the priest will accept. So that's the kind of graft Josephus calls. No, I'm sorry. It's the Talmud that calls this Annas' Bazar, Bazar. Annas was the father of Caiaphas, who is the father-in-law of the. He was the one who had sort of initiated this. All right, way too much background, but do you understand? This is, and so Jesus comes in John 2 and puts a stop to this, and that quickly. How do you get away with it? You try and touch that guy. You know what I'm saying? All those people there, and now the same thing. He comes on Monday morning, and he cleanses the temple and galvanizes the hatred of the Sadducees with the hatred of the Pharisees, but he delights the people. Oh my goodness! Now in John 2, when he cleansed the temple, as far as we know, he left. In this cleansing of the temple in the Synoptics in Monday the Passion Week, he possesses the temple for 2 days. Now, it's hard to say. Mark says that it's hard to say exactly what that looked like. This was crowded, hundreds of thousands of people up here, only 8 gates to get you into the temple, but Herod's temple. But evidently, I don't know if he put in a pot. Mark says that he would not so much as allow a man to carry a vessel of water across the temple. And whether it was a shortcut or whatever, Jesus took control. Now, folks, think about this. This is dramatic because yesterday he rode in and presented himself as Messiah. Now on Monday morning, he returns and he takes possession of the temple. Malachi says specifically that the messenger of the covenant, which is a title of the Messiah, will come suddenly to his temple. Ezekiel has 9 chapters describing the temple from which Messiah would rule. Everybody knows that when Messiah comes, he will rule in the temple. And now for 2 days, listen, Jesus, I'll say this, that not only did he possess the temple, but then when he came back on Tuesday, discovered the fig tree is withered up. Then he went back to the temple and began to teach. And each one of his, not personally, but each group first of all, the Sadducees, then the Pharisees, and then the Sadducees come, and they try and catch him in his words. Remember that? And, this is just magisterial. But the point I was going to make is that Jesus never, ever behaves so messianically as on these 2 days. And if you'd have been there, I think you'd have been pretty convinced. It's here. It's here. Messiah comes. He brings a kingdom. Here he is in the temple, and he's doing miracles. These whole 2 days, he's doing miracles. He cleansed the temple on Monday. Now he possesses it on Tuesday. And very quickly, first of all, the Sadducees come, and they say, by what authority to do these things? I get lost in this. Jesus was so clever. All right, I got to back up and tell you this. Can you hold on for this? I said to you before that throughout his ministry, Jesus claimed to be Messiah. But the word Messiah means a lot of things. It's not a very important word in the Old Testament. 9 times it's used of the coming deliverer. But during the intertestamental period, that one Christos, Mashiach, Messiah, became the one title that summed up everything that the Hebrew Scriptures promised concerning their coming deliverer. And above all things, it means king. It's not as dominant as it should be in our minds, but it means king. Rome will not stand for pretender kings. And so Jesus claims to be Messiah, but he carefully avoids the word Messiah. He doesn't ever claim, all throughout his period when he's making the case for himself, he never uses the title Messiah of himself. What he does is take to himself scores of different Old Testament titles and passages and so on that every Jewish person is going to hear as Messiah. Whereas, what's Jesus' favorite title for himself? 81 times, Son of Man. Where's that come from? Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days, after those four beasts, the Gentile kingdom, the Ancient of Days comes and takes his throne, and one like unto a Son of Man came, and he appointed him to establish a fifth. Every Jewish listener knows that when he talks about himself as the Son of Man, he's claimed to be Messiah. But what if you go to Pilate and you say, this guy's trouble? Well, what's the deal? He claims to be the Son of Man. What's Pilate? Me too. What are you talking about, for heaven's sake? So honest to goodness, Jesus is a genius in that regard. Does that make sense to you? And this is one of the reasons that his enemies are so frustrated, because they and at the Feast of Tabernacles in John chapter 8, they come to Jesus and say, how long are you going to keep us in suspense? Tell us plainly, are you the Christ? And Jesus won't do it. He says, well, the works that I do and so on. So you hear what they're saying. And I'll come back to that later this afternoon. But the point is this, that Jesus was so circumspect, he made the claim to be Messiah, but going back to it, forgot where I was headed. But the point is that now, when he cleanses the temple, I know what I'm talking about. When the Sadducees come, this is so clever. It's more clever than we immediately see. They come and they say, tell us, by what authority do you do these things? Now, this is not just peak. They've spent all night trying to come up with a means by which they can catch him in his words. Or, more importantly, they can get him to say something that they can take to Pilate, because that's what this is all about. They've got to get Pilate to crucify him. He won't do it unless they can prove that he's a pretender king. He's a threat to Rome. So they want him to say, I'm Messiah. The kingdom, the temple belongs to me. No. This is what Jesus says. All right. And I'd love to take you through it. But this is rabbinical. This is yeshiva questioning. This is the way you argue and debate. And let me just tell you something. In this culture, our culture, you want to prove, some guy wants to prove himself, he's a man among men. What do you do? I don't know. Maybe beat everybody in the room in arm wrestling or something. In that culture, you want to prove yourself, you're a man among men to be admired. You defeat your opponent in open debate. There's nothing that's bigger in that culture, in the Jewish culture. And so now these Sadducees come and they say, by what authority do you do these things? And Jesus, they want him to say he's Messiah, but this is what he says. All right, I'll ask you a question. The baptism of John, was it of heaven or was it of men? It's genius. And they set aside. It seems like it's kind of non sequitur. Where'd that come from? But they step aside and they say, now, wait a minute. If we say the baptism of John was of heaven, he announced this person as Messiah. So if he's speaking for God, we got our answer. He's Messiah. But if we say that John the Baptist was not of heaven, of men, these people will stone us because they love John the Baptist. And so now they go back to Jesus and they say, we have no answer. Folks, the place would have exploded. There'd have been huzzas and cheers and laughter and so on. Jesus just absolutely demolished these high priests, for heaven's sake. All right, then the Pharisees with their, lawful to pay Caesar, pay tribute, take a coin, look at both sides. They come back, they say, you've answered well, we have no answer. And then the Sadducees sucker for punishment, with the woman with the 7 husbands. I always say I think she was poisoned in the soup, but whatever in the world. But it's just a story. But the point is, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be? And Jesus magisterially, number one, he says, you err not knowing the scriptures. Then he takes, here, one of the dynamics, I think I showed it to you on the chart, is the Sadducees rejected the Hebrew scriptures except for the Pentateuch, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And they really didn't believe that. But one of those books is Leviticus, and Leviticus tells you to go to the temple and pay your tithes, and they knew their bread was buttered, so they gave lip service to the Pentateuch. And I think Jesus may be saying, okay, I'll play by your rules. And if I ask you to prove the resurrection in the Old Testament, that's not hard. You Daniel, Isaiah, Job, for heaven's sake. If I ask you to prove it from the Pentateuch, that'd be a little tougher. But Jesus does. He goes to Exodus, the burning bush. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They've been in their tombs for hundreds of years. God is a God of the dead, not a God of the dead, but of the living, and so on. So again, the Sadducees come back all shamefaced, and they say, we have no answer. And Luke 20, verse 40 says, after that, no man dared ask him any question at all. Oh, let me tell you, put the World Series and the World Cup and whatever you want, the Super Bowl, all together. None of them is as meaningful and dramatic a victory as when those men who were so desperate to catch him in his words, and Jesus silences them. And then Jesus goes on, and well, there's a young man who comes. He's called a lawyer, which means a law student. And his spirit is very different. His story is told in both Matthew and Mark. And he comes and he says to Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Now, this is probably not adversarial. There's an expression that the Jews use where they will say, if you want your rabbi to say, summarize the law, you would say, Rabbi, teach me the law on one leg. Now, the idea is that while you stand on one leg, summarize it. I think Jesus is teaching, he's answering that question. He's teaching the law on one leg. What's the greatest command? Love the Lord your God, love his. And of course, that man responds, and Jesus says, you're not far from the kingdom of God. Let me just tell you something. And we can check together. You go and check when we get there. But I think very possibly that young man was a law student who had a sister who lived in town. So he'd come from his hometown, which was Tarsus, and he was there in the city. And I think that very possibly is Saul of Tarsus, because later on, Jesus says on the road to Damascus, it's hard for you to kick against the ox goads. I think this is probably an ox goad moment, but there's more to that. It's kind of fun. But anyway, then Jesus claims, he goes to Psalm 110 to prove his messiahship, and but here's where I want to take you. So this is Tuesday. Jesus on Monday cleansed the temple. He comes back. And by the way, he's staying in Bethany. He gets there on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Now by Sunday, all right, let me just tell you this. I think it's so important. It's a dynamic of the culture, but Bethany is genius. In Luke chapter 10, just several weeks earlier, when Jesus was saturating the land of Judea, Luke 10 says that he had come to Bethany and met Martha and Mary, and Lazarus doesn't get mentioned there, but that family, a brother and two sisters. And so now when he comes up, we said he comes up from he's coming on his way to Jerusalem, and he stops at Bethany to keep the Sabbath, and he's going to stay there every night. He's going to go by. There's genius in that. There is a dynamic, and it's kind of, I don't think it's entirely noble, but there is a dynamic of Eastern culture you got to bring with you here. And that is the reality that if I invite you into my home, I become absolutely responsible for your safety. And I will do anything, whatever costs to me, my health, my family, because there's nothing more shameful than for me to allow somebody whom I have accepted to be somehow damaged. That makes sense to you? Now, you have this a couple times in the Old Testament. We don't like these passages, and I don't think at this point this is particularly noble. But remember Lot, who offered up his daughter? You say, who does that? That's the culture. And there's another one not so familiar, and that is the Ephraimite Levite who went down to Bethlehem to fetch his concubine. He comes up to Gibeah, and the men of Gibeah try and assault, and he throws the concubine out, you remember? And but before that, the man who had reluctantly accepted him into the house offered his daughters again. All right, now that this is what's called shame culture. And I don't think shame culture ought to cover any wickedness. Okay, I think sometimes, well, it's a shame culture. No, that's wicked. But nonetheless, this dynamic, this is what's behind the verse in the 23rd Psalm. Thou hast prepared a table before me, so you're my host, in the presence of my enemies. I can be perfectly at rest because you invited me and you're going to protect me. Well, see, what happens is Bethsaida, which is it's a nice town. There's some question as to whether it was walled, but they love Jesus. and Mary, Martha, and Lazarus live in that Bethany. I said Bethsaida. That's another city. That city of Bethany. And so Jesus and Bethany is right just off the main road. So there'll be constant traffic. So after Sunday, like I say, they were mad after Lazarus, but after he rode into the city, welcome now, they are just glow in the dark purple with rage. And so Jesus can protect himself by going out every night to Bethany. And he's going to be covered by the crowds. And then when you get there, both the Romans and the Jews know if we go in there and try and spirit him, grab him out of Bethany, there's going to be a riot that won't end. And so Jesus goes back on Sunday night after the cleansing of the temple, on Sunday after the triumphal entry, and then after the cleansing of the temple. So my point is that by this time, and now he's shamed all of his enemies and so on, they are absolutely beside themselves with anger. But now it gets worse. And this is what I want you to see. I'm going to go back to a couple things. Number one, remember that Jesus' very deliberate, effective strategy is to, the way he challenges what seems to be a willingness to follow him is to make demands. Sunday, it seemed like the city was willing to follow him. I'm answering the question, given Sunday, why Friday? And the fact is that as Jesus leaves, you have Matthew 23. I'm not going to take you there. You can go there, but Matthew 23, well, what would be simpler? Why not go there? But Matthew 23, this is late Tuesday, and late on Tuesday, after all of this drama, Jesus, as he leaves the city, he pronounces a series of the most excoriating woes. Do you know excoriating, what that word, where your corpus is this? Excoriate is to rip the skin off of. And that's what this is going on here. This is the most excoriating. And you have this series of woes. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. Now listen, notice something. He never mentions the Sadducees. Is that because they're not such crooks? No, they're crooks as bad as, but nobody wants to be like the Sadducees. But everybody is convinced that the way into the kingdom is to be loyal to your Pharisee. And so what Jesus is doing here once again, and I'm going to say, you're going to be so advantaged if you picture him pointing. So here he is on the Temple Mount. There are stoa or porches all along on each, and those porches have acoustical qualities, and he can be heard by, this is an oral culture, they know how to do this, he can be heard by thousands of people. And here are the Pharisees, and they're dogging his steps, and they're matter and hops, and nobody can miss him. And now pointing, I'm a woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You search land and sea to make one proselyte, and when you've made him, he's twofold more the son of hell than he was in the first place. You're like blind guides. He says at one point, remember, he says, you strain out a gnat and you swallow a camel. Folks, I'm telling you, that's hilarious. The place would have erupted. It's hilarious because it's such a beautiful, appropriate picture, cartoonish picture of these Pharisees. Everybody knows that they're adulterers, most of them, that they're as wicked as they can be, but they keep the law, and they do it better than anybody else, so it's okay. And then he goes on to say, well, you're like whited sepulchers. Now, that's fascinating because at Passover time, actually at any pilgrimage feast, because as I said, the Jewish people it was not their habit to bury in some cemetery somewhere. They'd bury on the back 40 somewhere, and maybe nobody's died for a while, and the tomb's gotten overgrown and so on, and somebody's coming up to the Passover, and he's a little tired. He says, I'm going to go take a nap. And he sits down, and you come around the corner, you say, I'm sorry, but you're leaning up against Granddaddy's tomb, and now you're unclean. You're going to the Passover, and you're unclean. You're not going to be able to go. And so the obligation was, this is rabbinical, that everybody go out and slap some white lye just on the door of the tomb, so people would know it was there. And interestingly enough, the Mount of Olives, which is 400 feet higher than the Temple Mount, is just festooned. It's just solid graves. And I picture Jesus maybe sweeping his hand across the horizon and saying, you're like so many whited sepulchers. You look good on the outside, but people just brush up against you, and they become a stench. Impure in the Bible is really, the Jews don't deal with abstraction. So everything always has, and to be impure The idea is you stink. You don't like to be around people who stink. God doesn't like you around him when you stink, and so you have to be pure. And so you're like so many whited sepulchres. You look fine, but people just brush up against you and they become a stench in God's nostrils. This is amazing. These are not words calculated to endear Jesus to the Pharisaic fraternity, right? But they are calculated to demand a decision on the part of the common man. Because on Sunday, oh, be our king. Listen, let me just tell you this. The messianic hope begins in Genesis 3. You know that. And it has to do with one issue: deliverance from the curse of sin. That's all that's at stake. As you go through the Old Testament, to be sure, God raises up a people, and because those people are wicked, he says, I'm going to give you over to Gentile powers, and part of Messiah's duty, responsibility, will be to deliver that covenant people from the Gentile powers. But it all, at base, is always salvation. That makes sense to you? Well, here's the point. That generation to which Jesus came, they were happy to make him the military deliverer, to accept him as the deliverer from Rome. Remember in John chapter 6, after he fed the 5,000, it says, this is kind of mysterious, they tried to take him by force and make him king. But then Jesus the next morning preached a sermon in which he said, this is another place where he put his finger on their spiritual nerve. And the next morning he preached a sermon in which he said, I'm the bread of heaven. I come down unless you depend upon me like the Jews in the wilderness depended upon the physical bread. You're going to die in your sins. And John 6 verse 66 says, after that they all went home. After that his disciples left. So my point is that generation was happy to acknowledge and accept and welcome Jesus as their deliverer from Rome. But as soon as he talked about being their deliverer from sin, they wanted nothing to do with him. And I'll tell you why. Because they knew that they couldn't deliver themselves from Rome, but they had the Pharisees. And they were happy with the idea that they could deliver themselves from sin. See, the issue, listen, folks, the issue that you faced when you came face to face with the gospel, with every single person, the issue at stake is pride. It's not strength, that we don't have enough strength, it's pride. And I like to say that we talk about faith, we treat faith sometimes as some sort of a strength. You got to have the strength. I always like to say faith is not Popeye's spinach can. You know what I'm saying? Like, I got to do it, I can't do it. Now I got them. No, faith is an admission, I have no strength. That's what faith is. It's dependent upon somebody else. And what's the issue is not that I don't have the strength, but I will not submit to the reality that I can't do it on myself, that God ought to be happy with me as I am. I can keep my own. And to come to the end of yourself is to realize none of that works. I got a pet. And so my point is, Jesus on that afternoon, when he puts them, and it's exactly parallel to the Sermon on the Mount. They say unto you, I say unto you, there's a broad gate, there's a narrow gate. Now he is saying, you choose. He puts, and he winds up at the end of Matthew 23 by calling them a brood of vipers. And now this is the Pharisees specifically. So, he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Oh, no, I'm not there yet. I should have marked it. What is it? 33? Yeah, there it is. Thank you. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape? Now, again, folks, there is not every jaw on a Temple Mount is dropped. You know what I'm saying? Listen what he's saying. And he goes on and on. And he winds up by saying, you brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Now, what's at stake is this, and we got to take a break here in just a bit, but what's at stake is this, that on Tuesday afternoon, Jesus leaves the Temple Mount after all of those excitement. Sunday, the triumphal entry, Monday, the cleansing, Tuesday, all the excitement of confronting his enemies and so on. But he leaves the people with those condemnations ringing in their ears. And like I say, what's at stake here? Given Sunday, why Friday? And the answer is because Monday and Tuesday, Number one, he asserts his messianic authority in the most dramatic way by taking control of the temple. But then, as he leaves, he drives the people to a decision. Does that make sense to you? It's me or the Pharisees. Now, we're going to come to this in the next hour, but they have a couple of days to think about this until Friday morning when the question is put to them. Who do you want me to give you, Barabbas or Jesus? We'll talk about that. All right, that's Tuesday. I'm going to talk about Wednesday, and I think you have a very brief section. And I just say Wednesday, brief, there's nothing. Let me just say, and that she's just taking that from my notes. Those are my notes. But let me say, and I don't want to get into this. I mean, I can't. We don't have time. Sunday night, we're going to gather for just kind of an auxiliary session. And one of the questions I'd like to talk about is the day of Jesus' crucifixion. I'm not going to go into it now. I believe, and it's been, we don't do theology or history by consensus, but it's been the absolutely overwhelmingly widely accepted chronology that Jesus died on Friday. I realize it's an issue, and there are many who you may have been taught that he died on Thursday, some even Wednesday, though not much anymore. I'm not going to talk about it, except to say this: it has to do with the 3 days and 3 nights. That's a legitimate concern, and I think it is very, very answerable. And we'll deal with that at length. At length. I'll walk you through it rather carefully. You have an appendix that will help, but I'll walk you through that on Sunday night when we have time together. But let's just for now say this: that if you take, and I do, and this is my notes and reconstruction is built on this, and this is the prevailing, again, I don't mind not embracing the prevailing idea, but this is the prevailing idea, that the triumphal entry was on Sunday and that the crucifixion was on Friday. Now, as you put the gospel records together, that means that Wednesday is a silent day. That is, the record springs, and I should say this, we already talked about it, but it was on Tuesday night, after Jesus went back to Bethany, that Judas sneaked off to a hill south of Jerusalem, called to this day the Hill of Evil Counsel. That's its official name. And the reason it's called that is because that was the personal home of Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas, the great criminal of this story, is the high priest who presides over the Sanhedrin, and he has a personal home. He has a villa that we're going to visit here, as it were, just a bit, where Jesus is going to be taken to be tried by the Sanhedrin. But he also, that's kind of whoever is the high priest gets that, but he's going to be for 18 years. But on the other hand, there is a hill south of the city, and he has a beautiful villa there. His whole family lives there. It's really been established. They found his burial cave, and his name's on it, and so on. On one of the ossuaries, it says Caiaphas. So the point is, Judas sneaks off on Tuesday night and makes a bargain. And that bargain is to help. All right, let me just say this. There's a lot of confusion as to why Judas was contracted, if you don't mind. And the standard idea is that he was hired to identify Jesus. Like Sanhedrin wanted to arrest him, but they couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Okay, now think about what we're talking about. That's not very likely. There was no set of facial features more familiar than that of the Nazarene. That idea comes from the kiss, the one whom I kiss. All right. In order to arrest Jesus, and we're going to talk about this, but in order to arrest Jesus, the Sanhedrin had to use Roman soldiers. Matter of fact, they came with a whole cohort of soldiers. We'll talk about it. But the fact is, the soldiers didn't know who Jesus was. They were mercenaries. They lived in the fortress there north of the temple itself. And so the kiss was for the soldiers. That makes sense to you? But in fact, we know that the Sanhedrin, but why was Judas hired? We're told explicitly in Luke 22 and verse 6. And that is, he came to him and they gave him money, and he promised to help them arrest Jesus. Here it is, in the absence of the multitude. Remember, I've said this before, Jesus is so careful. How are we going to arrest him and not produce a riot? Now, what happens is, late on Tuesday night, a plot is laid. And that plot is to get, number one, to get Jesus arrested in connection with the Passover, in the absence of multitude. It's not as if Judas is going to follow him around, and send up a flare or something when nobody's around. That's not the point at all. They know that 2 nights from now is the Passover, and Judas, the Passover has to be taken inside with no more than 20 and no fewer than 10 and each lamb and so on. So he knows, they don't know where. Judas doesn't know where, but he knows that they're going to be alone on Thursday night, and everybody else will be alone. So it'll be a quiet night. So the whole plan is to have Jesus arrested, tried, sentenced, and on his way to execution before the city wakes up. That's everything. Because they have every reason to believe. They've got Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday ringing in their ears, and they have every reason to believe. Now, what they don't understand and can't appreciate is the dynamics of what Jesus did on Tuesday night. Well, Tuesday afternoon, when he drove them to it, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, the Romans, they don't think about that. So they know that they're confident that if we try and arrest them, the people around, it's going to be a riot. So we got to do it in the middle of the night. Now that plot could only be laid. I mean, both Matthew and Mark, Matthew 26 and Mark 14, are explicit that the Pharisees and Sadducees threw their hands in there and said, we got to kill this guy, but not during the feast, lest there be a riot among the people. And yet he dies during the feast. How does that happen? Judas comes and makes this offer. And again, the way Matthew and Mark tell this story and the way they position that story about the anointing would suggest that he was still simmering over that innocent rebuke, that sort of generic rebuke that had stung his wicked soul back on Saturday night. But at any rate, on Tuesday night, that deal is made. By the way, just like to have fun here, but there's a very dominant building that sits on that. And as you stand in Jerusalem almost anywhere and look south, that's the Hill of Evil Council. Not part of Jerusalem, never was part of Jerusalem. It's the hill to the south. That's where Caiaphas had his, that's where Judas went. So we call it the Hill of Evil Council. But today, only because God has a sense of humor, today it's dominated by the UN building. So the UN sits up there, and we all have a lot of fun with that. But coming back to it, we're going to take a break, but if you go with a Sunday triumphal entry, which you should, and a Friday crucifixion, which I'm absolutely convinced is accurate, then the record skips from Tuesday, where Judas makes that deal, until Thursday, when Jesus sends Peter and John to prepare for the Passover. So you've got a gap in time. It's not unusual, but I think it's all important, and there is some. So I'm just going to say that I think that Silent Wednesday, I think it's demanded by the record, and to me it makes good sense, because that plot was only laid on Tuesday. It's going to be sprung on Thursday afternoon. If and it's collapsed. Some people have a Palm Monday, some people have a Thursday crucifixion, but anyway, you take that day away, and you only have a few hours to get everything in readiness, and it involves 600 soldiers, a cohort, John says, who are going to come to arrest Jesus. You don't just say, knock, 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 hey, I need 600 soldiers. You're going to have an order's going to come through, and it's going to be very official, and then they're going to have to prepare themselves and so on. But after that, there's going to be a trial in the middle of the night where 70 very old guys who live all over the city are somehow going to convene in one place. That's all got to be set up. And then the worst part is that after the Sanhedrin finally gets Jesus to acknowledge that he is Messiah, they're going to take him to Pilate at 4:30 in the morning. And because the Jewish authorities don't want to go into a Gentile household, they talk him into setting up his whole judicial apparatus outside. That's a lot of logistical preparation. See what I'm saying? So I'm looking for coherence. I think it's an important element. And it's hard to imagine how, if there's not that silent day, all that could be done. But given that silent day, the historical record becomes very, very coherent. Does that make sense to you? So that's Sunday, day of triumphal messianic presentation, triumphal entry. Monday and Tuesday, day of messianic proclamation, if you don't mind, given Sunday, White Friday. So now Thursday, the drama unfolds. Okay, we're done.